What's up guys, it's Mike for SimRacing604, and today I'm going to be talking to you about force feedback in Automobilista 2, and more specifically how to set it up for your particular wheel and preferences. There's no single best setting for force feedback, so I'm going to walk you through the process of setting it up and finding the settings that work best for you. And just a quick note of housekeeping before I start the video, and I want to cover the theory behind setting force feedback. I'm aiming this video at users of AMS2 that have a force feedback capable gaming wheel, and I'll quickly define what force feedback is, why we use it, and some principles of what is considered good force feedback. So force feedback is the rumble we get through our gaming wheel, and we use this to help define what the car is doing on track. And with good force feedback, we should be able to feel the tires losing grip on the road surface or going over rough surfaces like curbs. When the force feedback is set well, these feelings help us get around the track by supplementing the visual and audio cues we're getting from the game. The definition of good force feedback varies from person to person, but in general, lighter is better, and your settings should definitely not push the motor so hard that it can no longer produce the individual effects. This is what we refer to as clipping. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's take a look at the settings in Automobilista 2 that we can change to get the best feeling force feedback with no clipping. As you can see, we have 5 parameters that we can change. The type, which is a toggle between the game's default force feedback profile and a custom force feedback file that you may be able to download in the future. The gain, which is the overall strength of the wheel resistance while driving. The low force boost, which is a setting that makes lower end consumer wheels feel more force feedback effects. The FX, which is how pronounced the various effects like road feel are, and the menu spring strength, which is how fast the wheel will return to center in the menu screens. And we'll start with the menu spring strength first, since it's the easiest to deal with. This setting doesn't affect your driving experience at all, and only takes effect in the menu screens. A lower value will return your wheel to center very slowly, while a higher value will return your wheel to the center very fast. I keep this low, and I'd suggest you do the same. I can't imagine there's any scenario where you'd be in a rush to have your wheel return to the center position while in the game menus. We'll start looking at the in-game settings by first setting the type. At the time of this recording, there are no third-party force feedback files available for Automobilista 2. Your only option right now is to use the default force feedback, so be sure to leave it on that setting. In the future, if someone releases a custom force feedback file that you decide to use, you'll need to change this to custom. Next is the low force boost. Niels Huysingveld, who is one of the true geniuses of our genre, wrote a piece on setting force feedback in 2016, and he noted the original Automobilista users with Logitech or similar wheels should set this at about 80%, and those with higher end consumer wheels like a T500 or a Fanatec Club Sport should set it at about 20 to 40%, and those of us with direct drive wheels can turn this right off. What this setting does is raise the intensity of the subtle or light force feedback that might not be translated to lower end consumer wheels. So if you find that there's extended periods on track where you're not feeling anything through your wheel, you can try Niels' recommendation settings and see if that helps. I had a viewer let me know that with AMS2, even direct drive wheel users should use a little bit of low force boost, even if only 10 or 20 points. Next to talk about is the FX setting. This is linked to the gain setting, so we'll need to set this now and return to tweak it after we get our gain level set. To start, set this to 50. This is a neutral level of road effects. Setting this too low can make the car feel like it's floating on the track, and setting it too high can give you a bunch of unnecessary noise through your wheel and make it harder to detect what your car is doing on track. For now, set it to 50. And finally, we have the gain setting, or how strong the wheel resistance is on track. Higher settings make the wheel more difficult to turn. We'll set this through a process of addition rather than subtraction, and a good place to start would be around 20. Take a car that you can drive out to a track you know well. The track should have some rough curbing to help set a reference. If you're stuck or looking for suggestions in AMS2, take a P2 or P3 class car out to Alton Park. Even if you're not particularly fast with that car-track combo, you should be able to get the necessary information for setting force feedback. Run some laps and get a feel for the strength. Can you feel some light resistance when going through a fast corner? Can you turn the wheel comfortably when cornering without having to strain? If you can't feel any resistance, go back and turn the gain up by about 10 points and see if there's some resistance in the high-speed corners now. Repeat this process until you can feel a small but noticeable amount of resistance in the corners, but not enough to feel like you're working hard to get around the track. Having this resistance feeling will put the framework in place for you to be able to feel the car when it loses grip, like in a situation with a wet track. If the resistance is suddenly gone, you're sliding. As a rule, I like to be able to turn my wheel at any point during a lap with my non-dominant hand using only my index finger and thumb. While I'm doing this, if I'm feeling a moderate amount of resistance, that tells me the force feedback is light enough to easily manipulate the wheel with my hands, but informative enough to give my wheel the necessary forces. Once you have the weight set to your liking, and again, it's better to err on the side of light rather than heavy, you can revisit the FX setting. As a reminder, the higher the setting, the more bumps and road effects you'll feel. So too much can saturate the force feedback, so experiment on track like you did with the gain until you have the wheel translating things like curbs and rough tarmac to your liking through the wheel. Keep in mind though that adding too much FX could possibly push your wheel into clipping if you have your gain set too high. So make sure you only add enough effects to give you the ability to feel the road, and the effects should never feel crunchy or jarring. The feeling you're generally aiming for is a smooth rumble from your wheel. You'll need to make small adjustments to your gain and FX settings as you switch between cars in AMS2, so don't think of it as ever really being finished or a final setting. Instead, keep yourself open to making small adjustments as you get more used to the feeling of driving in this sim. With a good baseline setting though, you should be able to just make minor adjustments as you go, and the force feedback should be able to translate the feelings of what the car is doing on track with a reasonable amount of resistance in any car. And to close things out here guys, and hopefully drive home the point about starting light and keeping it as light as possible, it's worth noting that many of the top sim racers in the world use very light or sometimes no force feedback. To me, coming from an immersive rather than a competitive mindset, this doesn't appeal to me. A wheel without force feedback is a total immersion breaker for me, and it feels unnatural. With that said though, the underlying message from people who take sim racing very seriously is to keep things light. With less resistance, you'll theoretically be able to move the wheel faster since you're not working against any mechanical forces from the wheel, and you'll also be less fatigued throughout a long race since your arms are doing less work. Keep in mind that we're talking about very minute differences in reaction time and fatigue, but for those in the realm where thousandths of a second count, this is definitely a factor. So in summary, force feedback is a personal preference. You should be able to set your force feedback up in a short span of time in Automobilista 2 with a good starting point for gain and FX. Keep making adjustments as needed, and make sure you have just enough information coming from the wheel to help give you a sense of what the car is doing in concert with the visual and audio cues coming from the game. Keep the resistance lighter rather than heavy, and make sure you're making ongoing adjustments as needed to get the feeling just right. Thanks for watching guys, and we'll see you next time.